Chapter 11 of A Cousin's Conspiracy, or A Boy's Struggle for an Inheritance, by Horatio Alger, Jr. This recording is in the public domain. By Abigail Rasmussen. Chapter 11. Under Watch and Ward. The farmhouse was built after the model of many similar houses in New England. It was of 2 stories, with the front door in the center and a room on each side. Over the 2 stories was an unfurnished attic. "Have you a secure place to keep our friend here?" asked Luke. The farmer paused before he answered. "I might put him in the attic," he said. But here his wife interfered. "I couldn't sleep if he were in the house," she said. "Why not?" asked Luke. "You see he is securely bound, and will be as helpless as a child. Will you show me the attic?" "Follow me," said the farmer. They went up 2 flights of stairs and found themselves in a long room, the whole width of the house. Through the center rose the chimney. The sloping roof was not plastered. The only furniture consisted of a cot bedstead and a chair. "Is the attic occupied by any of the family?" asked Luke. "Not generally. When I hire an extra hand at harvest time he sleeps here." "But at present there is no one occupying it?" "No." "Then I suggest that the bed will prove a good resting place for our friend below. I have no doubt he has often found himself in lodgings less comfortable." "But," said Mrs. Mason nervously, "if he should get free during the night he might murder us all in our beds." "There is little chance of that. When your husband bound him he did a good job. I wouldn't undertake to get free myself if I were bound as securely." "That's so," said the farmer, pleased with the compliment. "He can't get away nohow." Over in the corner there were a couple of horse blankets which seemed to offer a comfortable resting place. Luke Robbins eyed them thoughtfully. "I have an idea," he said. "Let the outlaw lie there, and one of us can occupy the bed. Then he won't be able to try any of his tricks." "I would rather not sleep there," observed the farmer nervously. "I couldn't sleep in the same room with one of the Fox brothers." "Then if you couldn't sleep there you are just the man we want. You will always be on the watch, and can frustrate any attempt to escape." "No, no," said Ezekiel Mason hurriedly. "Kate could not close her eyes if she thought I were alone with John Fox." "No," answered Mrs. Mason with a shudder. "I won't let Ezekiel sleep in the same room with that bold, bad man." "I wouldn't be afraid myself," said the farmer, trying to keep up his reputation for courage, "but I don't want my wife to be anxious." Luke Robbins smiled, for he understood very well the timidity of his host. "Then," he said, "as I have no wife to be anxious about me, perhaps I had better sleep here." "Yes, that will be much better," rejoined the relieved farmer. "You are a brave man. Mr. Fox won't get the better of you." "Not if I can help it," said Luke. "Will that suit you, Mrs. Mason?" "Why don't you take him on to the jail at once?" asked the woman. "I shall feel worried if he spends the night in this house." "I hear that he has escaped from jail no less than 3 times. If he should do so tonight he would at once come here, and perhaps bring some of his band with him. He knows there is a good sum of money in the house." "I shall be glad when it is paid out," said the farmer's wife. "Don't worry, Mrs. Mason. I have promised your husband that no harm should come to him, and that the money should be secure, and I will keep my word." "So you did," said Ezekiel, brightening up, "and I will pay you what I agreed if you keep your promise." "Friend Mason," responded Luke, "I am playing for higher stakes than $5. All depends on my keeping this outlaw secure. I mean to do it." Having settled matters, they went downstairs again, where they found their prisoner waiting impatiently for their reappearance. "Well," he said, "have you decided to let me go?" "I am sorry to disappoint you, my friend," answered Luke, "but I don't see my way clear to do so." "I promised you $1,000 if you would release me." "Yes, but I haven't any confidence in that promise." "You need not fear. In 3 days I would bring or send the money to you here." "Couldn't you oblige me with a check on the bank where you keep your money?" asked Luke, smiling. "I keep my money in several banks," returned the outlaw. "Where, for instance?" "I had some in the bank at Lee's Falls, but I drew it out the other day." "So I heard. Have you any money in the Emmonsville bank?" "Yes, but I'm not quite ready to take it yet.
I can give you an order on the bank if that will suit." "Thank you. I doubt if the order would be honored." "All this talk amounts to nothing," said Fox impatiently. "I tell you that if you release me I will bring or send you the money." "And how soon would you want it back again?" "Whenever I saw my way clear to taking it," said the outlaw boldly. "I like that talk. It looks square. I'll think over your offer, friend Fox, and let you know in the morning what I decide to do." The outlaw frowned. He evidently did not like the prospect of remaining in captivity overnight. "What are you going to do with me tonight?" he asked. "We have a comfortable place provided," answered Luke. "Mr. Mason, if you will give your assistance, we will show our guest where we propose to put him." "Unbind me and I will save you the trouble." "No doubt, but there are some objections to that." The outlaw was lifted from the wagon and carried upstairs to the attic. His ankles as well as his wrists were securely tied so that he was unable to walk. "Friend Fox," said Luke politely, "there is a bed and there is a shakedown," pointing to the blankets on the floor. "You can take your choice. I hope you will like your hotel." "I shall like it better if it provides refreshments," replied Fox. "I am famished." "I am sure Mrs. Mason will furnish you with a meal. I will speak to her." The outlaw seated himself on the bed, and the cord about his wrists were loosened so that he might be able to eat. This might have been regarded as dangerous, as affording him an opportunity to escape, but for two reasons. In a chair opposite sat Luke Robbins with a revolver in his hand, watching his prisoner sharply. "If you make any attempt to escape," he said quietly, "I shall shoot. Now you understand and will be guided accordingly." In spite of his unpleasant situation, the outlaw could not help admiring the coolness and resolution of his guard. "You would make a capital accession to my band," he remarked. "If that is meant for a compliment," said Luke dryly, "I thank you." "You had better think it over. Join my band and I will make it worth your while." He fixed his eyes earnestly upon his captor to see whether he had made any impression upon him. "When I start on any road," he said, "I like to know where it is coming out." "Well, this road will lead to wealth." "I don't read it that way." "How then?" "It will more likely lead to a violent death, or the gallows." "I have been on that path for 10 years, and I am alive and a prisoner." "Yes, at present, but I can tell you this, my Quaker friend, that the tree has not yet grown that will furnish a gallows for John Fox." "Perhaps so, but I don't feel sure of it." The outlaw's predicament did not appear to interfere with his appetite. When he had completed his meal, Luke called the farmer and requested him to tie his wrists again. "You can do it better than I," he said. "Besides, I shall need to stand guard." Chapter 12 of A Cousin's Conspiracy, or A Boy's Struggle for an Inheritance, by Horatio Alger, Jr. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Abigail Rasmussen. Chapter 12. John Fox Finds a Knife. The outlaw was left for several hours alone in the attic of the farmer's house. He felt far from comfortable, and he experienced great mortification at the thought that he had been captured by a Quaker. "I shall never hold up my head again. That is," he added after a pause, "unless I circumvent him and get away." Fox dragged himself to the window and looked out. "If only my brother knew where I was," he reflected, "he would soon turn the tables on those clodhoppers." But, as he knew, his brother was 20 miles away on a different expedition. John Fox was a man of expedients. In his long career as an outlaw he had more than once been in a hole, but he had never failed by some means to extricate himself. It was not for some time that he bethought himself of a knife that he had in his pocket. If he could get it out he would be able to cut the ropes that bound him and escape if he were not interfered with. He looked out of the window again and saw Luke Robbins and the farmer walking up the road. "They think I am safe," soliloquized Fox, "but perhaps they may find themselves mistaken." He reflected with satisfaction that there was no one in the house but Mrs. Mason and himself. Yet, as matters stood, he was helpless even against her. As it was uncertain how long his two jailers would be absent, it behooved him to escape as soon as possible. There was a difficulty in the way, as his hands were securely tied together at the wrist, and he could not thrust them into his pocket and obtain the knife. But possibly by rolling over he might manage to make it slip out. It seemed the only possible way to accomplish his object, so he at once set to work. Rolling over and over, he at length found himself in such a position that the knife, a large jackknife, slipped from the gaping mouth of the pocket. "Ha! That is the first step toward success," he cried triumphantly. Next he must pick up the knife and open it. This was easier than the first step. His hands were tied at the wrist, but his fingers were free. It seemed a simple thing to open the knife, but it took him some time. At last, however, he succeeded. "That is the second step toward liberty," he said in a jubilant tone. The next thing was to cut the cord that bound his wrists. That was difficult. In fact, it took him longer than both the first steps together. It chanced that the knife had not been sharpened for a long time. Then the cord was stout and thick, and even had his hands been free, it would have taken him some time to cut it. If they should come back it would be maddening, he reflected, and as the thought came to him he looked out of the window. But nowhere were the two men visible. "They are fools. They don't know me," said the outlaw. He resumed his efforts to cut the cord. After 20 minutes the last strand parted, and with a feeling of relief John Fox stretched out his hands free once more. His feet were tied, but with his hands at liberty there was little difficulty in cutting the rope that tied them. In less than 5 minutes the outlaw rose to his feet a free man. He smiled a smile of exultation and triumph. "My Quaker friend will be surprised to find me gone. He will understand John Fox a little better. He will have to wait a little longer for his $1,000. John Fox was himself again, but for the first time in 10 years, except when he was the temporary tenant of a jail, he was unarmed. "What has that fellow done with my revolver?" he asked himself. "If it is anywhere in the house I won't go off without it." Half an hour earlier he would have been content with his liberty. Now he wanted his revolver, and his thoughts recurred to the money which the farmer had drawn that morning from the bank. It was $500, as Luke had rather incautiously let out. John Fox was not without hopes of securing both. The coast was clear, and only Mrs. Mason was left in the house. He might terrify her, and so secure what he had set his heart upon. But there was no time to be lost, as Luke and the farmer might return any minute. The outlaw went downstairs, stepping as lightly as he could. On the lower floor Mrs. Mason was in the kitchen preparing the evening meal. She had at first been reluctant to remain alone in the house with the outlaw, but Luke had reassured her by the statement that he was securely bound and could not get away. She turned from the stove at the sound of a footfall. There was the notorious outlaw standing in the doorway, with an ironical smile upon his face. The terrified woman sank back into a chair and regarded John Fox with a scared look. "You here!" she exclaimed. "Yes, Mrs. Mason, it is I." "How did you get free? My husband told me that you were bound." "So I was, and I will do your husband the justice to say that he understands his business. I had trouble to break loose." "However could you have done it?" asked the amazed woman. "I won't go into details, for there isn't time. Now listen to me and obey my commands. Your Quaker friend took my revolver away. I want you to get it and give it to me." "Indeed, I cannot do it, sir, for I do not know where it is." Mrs. Mason's tone was a terrified one. "That won't do," said John Fox sternly. "It is somewhere in the house. Look for it." "Indeed, sir, you are mistaken. I am sure that the Quaker gentleman has taken it with him." "I don't believe anything of the kind. He has no doubt a revolver of his own, and would not care to carry two." "You may be right, sir, but I don't know where it is." "Is there any revolver in the house?" he demanded impatiently. "I should prefer my own, but I will take any." "I will look, sir, if you wish me to." "Wait a minute. There is something else I must have. Where is that $500 your husband drew from the bank?" "I don't know." "Tell the truth, or it will be the worse for you." "I am ready to tell the truth, but I don't know." "Where does your husband usually keep any money he may have in the house?" "In the desk in the next room." "Probably he has put the money there. Is the desk locked?" "Yes." "Have you the key?" "Here it is, sir," and Mrs. Mason meekly passed him a small-sized key. "Good. I see you are growing sensible. Now come with me." Together they entered the room, and Mrs. Mason pointed to the desk. It was an ordinary upright desk. John Fox opened it with the key. The desk opened, the outlaw began at once to search eagerly for the money. There was a multiplicity of small drawers, which he opened eagerly, but he found no cash except 4 silver half-dollars and some smaller silver. "It isn't here," he said in a tone of sullen disappointment, turning a baffled look upon the farmer's wife. "No, sir, I didn't think it was there." "Where do you think it is? Do you think your husband has it with him?" "No, sir." "Where then can it be? Surely you must have some suspicion. Don't dare to trifle with me." "Indeed, I wouldn't, sir. I think the Quaker gentleman has it." "Curse him!" exclaimed the outlaw angrily. "Have you any other money in the house?" "No, sir." "I have a great mind to kill you," said Fox with a look of ferocity. The terrified woman uttered a scream of dismay that excited the fierce outlaw still more. He sprang toward her and seized her by the throat. Chapter 12. Of a Cousin's Conspiracy, or a Boy's Struggle for an Inheritance, by Horatio Alger, Jr. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Abigail Rasmussen. Chapter 13. Just in Time. John Fox had been so occupied with his terrified victim that he quite forgot the possibility of his two captors returning. It so happened that both were approaching the house when they heard Mrs. Mason's cry of terror. "What's that?" exclaimed the farmer in alarm. "I believe that scoundrel has got loose," answered Luke. He quickened his pace and entered the house just in time to become a witness of the outlaw's brutality. It was no time to hesitate or parley. He sprang upon the robber, dashed him to the ground, and put his foot upon his breast. "What deviltry are you up to, you wretch?" he demanded. Then turning to Mrs. Mason, he asked, "Why did he attack you?" "He wanted my husband's money and a revolver," answered the trembling woman. "I have a great mind to give him the contents of the revolver," said Luke sternly. John Fox was not a coward, but as he looked up at the stern face of the Quaker detective he quailed, almost for the first time in his life. He tried to rise, but the heavy foot of Luke Robbins was on his breast. "Let me up," he growled. "You don't deserve to get up. You shall lie there forever for your cowardice in attacking a woman." "I would rather it had been you," said John Fox bitterly. "You are safe in attacking a woman," said the detective in scornful sarcasm. The outlaw was stung by his assailant's scorn. "I have attacked many better men than you," he replied, "and some have not lived to tell the tale." "So you own up to being a murderer? I am ready to believe you. I have a great mind to shoot you where you lie," and Luke pointed his revolver at the prostrate outlaw. "That would be the act of a coward," said John Fox hastily, his cheek turning pale. "Not exactly that, for I have mastered you in a fair fight, but there is one thing that holds back my hand. Do you know what it is?" "Well?" "I should cheat the gallows of its due. Here, farmer." Ezekiel Mason, pale and trembling, was standing on the threshold. "What is it?" he asked. "Go and get another rope." The farmer left the house and going to an outhouse returned with a stout clothesline. "Tie him again while I hold him," was Luke's command. "Tie him as securely as before, more so if possible. How did you get loose?" "Find out for yourself," said the outlaw sullenly. "I mean to, and I don't intend that you shall escape a second time." Meanwhile John Fox was execrating his folly in not escaping when he had the chance. If he had not waited for the revolver and money he might by this time have been out of danger. Yet he was not without hope. He still had the knife in his pocket. It was ready for use, and he meant to use it. No doubt he would be taken back to the attic. If Luke Robbins should be his companion, all the better. After cutting his bonds, the knife might end the life of the man who had inflicted such humiliation upon him. He did not speak, but his eyes betrayed him. There was such a revengeful gleam in them that Luke read their meaning without trouble. "If I am ever at the mercy of that ruffian," he thought, "I wouldn't give much for my chance of keeping a whole skin." When the outlaw lay securely bound, Luke summoned the farmer. "Watch him for 5 minutes, Mr. Mason," he said. "I am going to the attic to learn if I can how he got loose." Ezekiel Mason looked uncomfortable, but did not object. He was half afraid of John Fox even in his helpless condition. "Have you a revolver?" "Yes." "Then take it out, and if he makes an effort to escape, shoot him without a moment's hesitation." It gratified the outlaw to see how much afraid of him the farmer was, even in his helpless condition. But he could not flatter himself that he had inspired any terror in Luke Robbins. Against his will he was compelled to pay tribute to the resolute courage of the Quaker detective. As he met the gaze of the farmer, he smiled to himself sardonically. "You've got the advantage of me," he said. "I am bound and helpless while you are free and are armed. Still you are afraid of me." "Why should I be?" asked Mason, but his tone was not firm. "Yes, why should you be? I'll tell you. If I ever have you where I am now, I'll give you 15 minutes to say your prayers." "Oh, what a terrible man!" said Mrs. Mason with a shudder. "You wouldn't kill him?" "Yes, I would, but there is one way of escape." "What is that?" "Loose these bonds and let me go before your Quaker friend comes down, and your life will be safe, and your wife's." Ezekiel Mason shook his head feebly. "I don't dare do it," he said. "Do as you please, but the time will come when you will be sorry that you refused. What are you afraid of? You are armed, while I have no weapon." "I am afraid of Luke." "You needn't be. He would find fault with you, but that would be all." Ezekiel Mason was weak, but not weak enough to yield to the persuasions of his prisoner. Besides, he knew that Luke would come down from the attic directly. In fact, he was already close at hand. He brought in his hand the cut fragments of the cord with which the outlaw had originally been bound. "This tells the story," he said, holding up the rope so that the farmer and his wife could see it. "This rope has been cut. The man has a knife." John Fox darted a malignant look at him, but said nothing. "You are smart, John Fox," Luke went on. "Smarter than I thought. Where is your knife?" John Fox did not reply. Luke Robbins knelt down and thrust his hand unceremoniously into the outlaw's pocket. He drew out the knife which had done him so much service. "This will be safer with me than with you," he said. "Would you rob me?" demanded the outlaw. "Yes, of anything it is not proper for you to have." To John Fox the disappointment was bitter. He was, if anything, more securely tied than before, and it would be quite impossible to loosen the ropes or free himself without the help of the knife. His hope of getting loose during the night and killing Luke was at an end. "Did he say anything while I was upstairs?" asked Luke. "Yes." "What was it?" "He wanted me to set him free." "Did he offer you money?" "No, but he threatened that he would some time take my life." "He is a terrible man," said Mrs. Mason, shuddering. "I shall not feel safe tonight with him in the house." "I don't propose to let him stay in the house all night." The prisoner, the farmer and his wife looked at Luke inquiringly. "I think, farmer," said Luke, "you'd better harness up and we will take our friend to the jail in Crampton." "What? Tonight?" "Yes. The sooner he is safely disposed of the better. At any rate, we will have shifted the responsibility to the authorities." "Yes, it will be better," said Mrs. Mason in a tone of relief. The buggy was made ready, and the outlaw was packed in the back part of it. Toward nightfall the warden of the prison at Crampton was startled by the arrival of the farmer and Luke, bringing with them the notorious outlaw whose name was in every mouth. He hardly knew whether to be sorry or glad, for no prison yet had been secure enough to hold him. "I will leave my name," said Luke, "and I shall hereafter claim the reward for his capture." Chapter 14.
Of a Cousin's Conspiracy, or a Boy's Struggle for an Inheritance, by Horatio Alger, Jr. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Abigail Rasmussen. Chapter 14. Ernest Has an Adventure. Luke Robbins remained at the farmhouse till the middle of the next day. At that hour the sum of money which Mason had withdrawn from the bank was transferred to the party for whom it was intended, and Luke's mission was at an end. He received from the farmer the stipulated $5 and started on his return to Emmonsville, Ezekiel Mason driving him the greater part of the way. Luke arrived at the bank half an hour before it closed and reported his success, including the capture of John Fox. He was congratulated on his success, but noticed that the officers of the bank looked grave. "Is anything the matter?" he asked. "Yes," answered the cashier. "At 1 o'clock yesterday we sent your young friend Ernest with $1,000 in United States bonds to the bank at Lee's Falls, and we have received no tidings from him." "What do you fear?" asked Luke hurriedly. "We fear that he may have been captured by some of the Fox gang and be in confinement, or else—" "What?" "Killed or wounded," added the cashier. "He could not have met John Fox, for I held him in custody." "There was the other brother, James, who was at large." "James is the tall brother?" "Yes." "Then," said Luke, "I shall have to hunt him too. Will you grant me leave of absence?" "Gladly. We want to recover the bonds, but we care still more for the safety of the boy." Indeed, Ernest had become popular with the bank officials as well as with the residents of Emmonsville. The cashier spoke truly when he said that he cared more for the boy's safety than for the recovery of the bonds. "Can you tell me anything that will help me in my expedition?" asked Luke. "Have you any idea where the Fox gang would be likely to carry Ernest?" "It is generally supposed that the band have a secret rendezvous somewhere within a dozen miles, but no one has been able to discover where it is." "And you think that Ernest would be carried there?" "Yes. They would hardly bring themselves to kill a young boy. He would be easily overpowered by a grown man, so there would be no excuse for murderous violence." "How did the boy go?" "He walked." "But it was a long distance." "Yes, about 10 miles. We at first thought of providing him with a saddle horse, but there was one objection." "What was that?" "He would have been more likely to be suspected of being out on some mission." Leaving Luke Robbins to start on his search for Ernest, we will go back to the time when the boy messenger left the bank on the day previous. The United States bonds were enclosed in an envelope and carried in an inner pocket, which had been expressly made by an Emmonsville tailor on his first connecting himself with the bank. The pocket was unusually deep, so as to accommodate a long parcel. This was the most important commission on which Ernest had been employed, and he was pleased with the confidence reposed in him. He did not dread the long walk, for he was a strong and active boy. Besides, he was authorized to accept a ride if one should be offered him. He would arrive at Lee's Falls after the bank was closed, but he was instructed to call at the residence of the cashier and leave the bonds. Ernest had walked 3 miles when he met with an adventure. On the borders of a small pond he caught sight of a small Indian boy playing. He was probably not more than 3 years of age. A stick he was playing with fell into the pond, and the little fellow reached over to recover it. In doing so he lost his balance and fell into the water. There was a scream and a splash, and Ernest no sooner saw the accident than he ran up, threw off his coat and vest, lest he should wet the bonds, and plunged into the pond. The young bank messenger was an expert swimmer, and in an instant had seized the child and placed him out of danger. The little Indian boy clung to him instinctively, feeling safe with his young protector. "Where do you live, little boy?" asked Ernest. "Out yonder," answered the child. Ernest had not been quite sure whether he would be able to understand or speak English, but having been brought up among white people he was as familiar with English as most white boys of his age. Ernest looked in the direction pointed out by the boy. At the distance of 100 rods he saw a rude log house. Smoke was curling from a chimney. Outside sat an Indian about 40 years of age, smoking a pipe. He seemed busily thinking, having the grave face characteristic of the average Indian. He did not immediately notice the approach of his little son, but when they were near the Indian boy uttered a cry, pronouncing some Indian word which possibly meant father. Then the red man looked up, and his grave face changed as he recognized his boy in the company of a young white stranger. He rose hastily from his seat and advanced to meet the two who were approaching. "What has happened?" he asked in clear and distinct English. "Your little boy fell into the water," explained Ernest. "And you saved him?" "Yes," answered Ernest modestly. "I saw him fall and I jumped in after him." "Was the water deep?" "About so," said Ernest, placing his hand about 5 feet from the ground. "Then he would have been drowned if you had not been near?" "Yes, if he could not swim." "He is too young to swim, but you are wet," added the Indian, noticing for the first time the condition of Ernest's clothes. "Yes, a little." "Come in," said the Indian abruptly. He led the way into the log cabin. There was a stove in the center of the room, and the air was so heated as to be uncomfortable. As he led the child in, a stout Indian woman came forward with a cry and took him in her arms. Her husband rapidly explained what had happened. She instantly stripped the clothes from the child and put on a dry change. "Now," said the Indian, turning to Ernest, "take off your wet clothes." Though Ernest knew that it was wise to do so, he felt bashful about removing them in the presence of the woman. But his Indian host brought from a nail in which they hung a pair of buckskin breeches of his own and offered them to Ernest for temporary use. Ernest no longer hesitated, but made the substitution. As the Indian was 4 or 5 inches taller than himself, the legs covered his feet. He laughed as he saw how they looked, and the Indian's serious face relaxed a little from the same cause. "Now I will dry your clothes," he said. He took a chair, and hanging the wet garments over the back, placed it very near the stove. Ernest hardly liked to lose so much time, but he knew that it would not be safe to wear the trousers in their soaked condition. "You speak English very well," he said, turning to the Indian. "Yes, I have spent much time with white people," was the answer. "Do you support yourself by hunting?" went on Ernest. "Yes, I am a hunter, but I go with rich white people from the cities and with Englishmen who want a guide." "And do they pay you well?" asked Ernest, not quite sure whether he was not showing too much curiosity. "Yes, they pay me well. I have some money in the bank." Then Ernest remembered having seen the Indian one day at the bank. He was told at the time that his name was John Castro, and that he had several $100 on deposit. Chapter 14. Of a Cousin's Conspiracy, or a Boy's Struggle for Inheritance, by Horatio Alger, Jr. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Abigail Rasmussen. Chapter 15. John Castro. While Ernest's clothes were drying, the Indian woman was bustling about the stove. The boy did not suspect her object till she placed on the table a plate of Indian cakes hot from the oven, and he was invited to partake. It was the first time he had ever been a guest in an Indian family, and he hesitated, but saw that his refusal to partake might hurt the feelings of his new friends. He seated himself at the table and found the cakes really very good. When his clothes were dry he rose to go.
"Won't you stay all night?" asked Castro.
"Thank you. I cannot spare the time. I must push on." "Where are you going?" asked the Indian. "To Lee's Falls." "I will go with you a short distance." So they set out together. At length John Castro stopped. "That is your way," he said. "I wish you a pleasant journey. I will not forget what you have done for my little son. If ever you are in trouble, send for John Castro." "I thank you." The Indian shook hands with him gravely and turned back toward his cabin. All this had taken time. Ernest had no watch with him, but he estimated that the adventure had cost him 2 hours. However, he had saved a boy's life. Again he had made a friend. The friend was an Indian, but Ernest was wise enough to consider that no friend, however humble, is to be despised. It was clear that he would reach his destination late, and he began to wish that some carriage would overtake him in which he might ask for a ride. But he walked 2 miles further without encountering any team. At last, however, he heard the rumble of wheels, and turning round to see whether there was room in the vehicle, he saw that it was a buggy driven by a tall, thin man with dark hair, swarthy face, and a long, aquiline nose. The driver eyed Ernest sharply, and brought the buggy to a standstill. "Where are you going, boy?" he asked. "To Lee's Falls." "Where have you come from?" "From Emmonsville." "It is a long walk." "Yes. Do you think you could give me a lift?" "Perhaps so. Jump in." Ernest lost no time in availing himself of the invitation. "Where were you going in Lee's Falls?" he asked. Ernest felt that it would be imprudent to mention that his destination was the bank, so he answered guardedly, "I am going to see the town. I may stop overnight." "At the hotel?" "Yes." "It is not much of a place to see," said the driver, watching his companion curiously. "It is larger than Emmonsville, isn't it?" "Yes. How long have you been in Emmonsville?" "Not long." "Where do you live there?" "At Mrs. Larkins'." "Do you go to school?" "No." Meanwhile the horse was traveling very slowly, and it seemed to Ernest that he would go over the road quite as fast if he had continued to walk. He began to think it was his turn to ask questions. "Are you going all the way to Lee's Falls?" he asked. "I may go nearly there." "I am very much obliged to you for giving me a lift. I was quite tired." The driver smiled. "Perhaps I have an object," he said. Ernest looked in inquiry. "The pleasure of your company," explained his companion with a smile. "Thank you," answered Ernest. "Now I come to look at you, I think I have seen you before," continued the driver. "Where?" "In Emmonsville, at the bank." Ernest became alarmed. There was a significance in his companion's tone which excited his alarm, but he did not dare show his feelings. He remained outwardly calm, though inwardly disturbed. "Very probably," he said. "I have been there." His companion laughed. He was playing with the boy as a cat plays with a captive mouse. Ernest began to consider whether he could not think of some pretext for getting out of the buggy. Suddenly the buggy stopped. "I will get out here," said Ernest quickly. "Not quite yet. I have not got through questioning you." "I am in a hurry," said Ernest. "You must wait till your hurry is over. Now tell me truly, are you not bound for the Lee's Falls bank?" Ernest was startled. "You see, I know more about you than you suppose. You are the bank messenger." It seemed useless to deny it. The question now was his secret packet in danger? "I have sometimes acted as bank messenger," he said warily. "And you are acting in that capacity now. What are you taking to the Lee's Falls bank?" Ernest turned pale. His worst fears were confirmed. "Why do you ask?" he said. "Because I want to know." "What business can it be of yours?" demanded Ernest boldly. "Don't be impudent, boy. Hand me the package of money." "I have no package of money." "Then you have bonds." Ernest remained silent. "I see that I have hit it. Now hand over the bonds if you value your life."
He spoke sternly and looked so fierce that the boy messenger became more and more alarmed. He saw that he must give up the package, but determined to hold out in his resistance as long as possible. "The package is not mine, and I have no right to surrender it," he said. "I'll take the responsibility, boy. You can't be blamed, for you can't help yourself." As he spoke he passed his hand over Ernest's vest, which he saw projected more than was usual, and discovered the hiding place of the important package. Instantly he had torn open the vest and drawn out the envelope. "I thought I should find it," he said in a tone of triumph. Ernest felt very much dejected. It was a mortification to lose the first large sum with which he had been entrusted. "Will you tell me who you are?" he asked abruptly. "First let me know who you think I am." As the driver spoke he eyed Ernest sharply. "Is your name Fox?" asked the young messenger. His companion laughed. "I know Mr. Fox," he answered. "You are either Fox or a member of his band." "You seem to be a sharp boy. I won't tell you whether you are right or not." "I suppose I may go now?" "Where do you want to go?" Ernest hesitated. This was a question which he could not at once answer. To go on to Lee's Falls without the packet would do little good. Yet the bank officers there ought to know that the bonds intended for them had been stolen. "I will go to Lee's Falls," he said. "Not at present. I have other views for you." As he spoke the robber turned his horse to the right. Wholly ignorant as to where he was to be carried, Ernest sank back in his seat and resigned himself as well as he could to the situation. Chapter 16. Of a Cousin's Conspiracy, or a Boy's Struggle for an Inheritance, by Horatio Alger, Jr. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Abigail Rasmussen. Chapter 16. In the Outlaw's Home. Where he was to be carried, or what was to be his fate, Ernest could not conjecture, nor did he speculate much. It was enough for him to know that he was in the power of one of the notorious outlaws. There was considerable difference between his appearance and that of the man at his side. He was silent and depressed, while James Fox, for it was he, seemed in excellent spirits. He turned to the boy with the remark, "You don't say much." "No, for it would be no good." "Brace up, boy. There's no occasion to look as if you were going to a funeral." "Give me back the bonds and I will look lively enough." "Come now, don't be foolish. These bonds don't belong to you." "They were given into my care." "Very well. You took as good care of them as you could." "I shall be held responsible for them." "No, you won't. I shall send your employers a letter letting them know that you did the best you could to keep them out of my hands. But perhaps they never heard of me," and he laughed. "If your name is Fox they have heard of you." "There's no need to beat about the bush. My name is Fox, James Fox." "What made you take up such a business, Mr. Fox?" asked Ernest gravely. "Well, I like that. You, a kid, undertake to lecture me." "You were once a kid yourself." The outlaw's face grew grave suddenly, and his tone became thoughtful. "Yes, I was a kid once. At 16. Is that your age?" "Yes." "Well, at 16 I was as innocent as you. I had a good mother then. If she had lived, perhaps I would have turned out different. Why, it seems a great joke, doesn't it? I attended Sunday school till I was 15. Are you afraid that you will come to harm?" Ernest looked intently in the brigand's face. "No," he said after a pause. "I think you won't do me any more harm, but you can do me a great favor." "What is that? Return you the bonds?" "I would ask that if I thought you would do it, but I don't expect it. I should like to have you release me and let me go home." "I can't do that, for I want you to visit me. You may not think it, but I always liked young people. It will be quite a pleasure to me to have you for a visitor." "Thank you, but I am afraid that I shall become an unwilling guest." "Besides, it will be a pleasure to my little boy to meet you. He does not often meet other boys." "Have you a son?" asked Ernest in surprise. The outlaw's face softened. "Yes," he answered. "He is a sweet little boy, as I can say even if he is my son. His name is Frank. Would you like to see his picture?" "Yes," Ernest answered with interest. James Fox drew from an inner pocket a small card photograph of a young boy with a very winning face. Ernest was attracted, for unlike many boys of his age, he liked younger children. He looked at the picture long and earnestly. "It is a sweet face," he said at last. "Isn't it?" asked the proud father. "Is his mother living?" "No." "Was there no difficulty in getting it taken?" "I suppose you mean on account of my profession. Well, there might be around here, but this was taken in Minneapolis about a year ago. It was one of the few visits that Frank has made with me." "Are you going to bring him up to your business?" "Take care, boy," said the outlaw, frowning. "Don't be impertinent." "I don't mean to be. Do you think the question an improper one?" "Well, perhaps I have no right to think so. Somehow the business, though it seems all right to me, I couldn't think of for my boy. No, I shall soon place him at school, where no one will know that he is related to the celebrated outlaw. I want him brought up to lead an honest life." "I am glad you do. I respect you for that." "My lad, you seem to be one of the right sort. As you will see my son, I want you to promise me that you won't say a word about the business I am engaged in." "I will make that promise. Then the boy doesn't know?" "No, he has no suspicion. He is too young to think much about that. Perhaps if he had associated with other boys much, he would have found out." While this conversation was going on, they had entered a wood, and the road became wilder and rougher. Indeed, it was hardly a road, but rather a lane, narrow and grass grown. Ernest began to wonder in what sort of a home his companion lived. His evident affection for his son gave Ernest a different feeling toward him. It was plain that he had a softer side to his nature, bandit though he was. Ernest had never read the story of Jekyll and Hyde, but he felt instinctively that the man beside him had a double nature. On the road he was an outlaw, with corresponding traits, a rough and unscrupulous man. But at home, and in the presence of his son, as Ernest judged, he was a warm-hearted and affectionate father. In truth, the young banker messenger looked forward with interest to a meeting with the boy who was so dear to the heart of a man whom the world generally supposed to be a stranger to the softer emotions. At length they reached a rocky hillside. Here the outlaw pulled up his horse and jumped from the buggy. Ernest looked at him in a questioning way. "You can get out," he said. "We have arrived." Ernest alighted and looked about him. He naturally expected to see a dwelling of some kind, but there was none in sight. If it was at a distance, why should they not have driven to it? James Fox looked at him with a smile, enjoying his perplexity. From his pocket he drew a large silk handkerchief. "Come here, my boy," he said. Ernest did not quite understand what he proposed to do, but he felt better acquainted with the outlaw now, and he knew that there was no cause for apprehension. He accordingly approached without question. James Fox bandaged his eyes so that he could see nothing. Then he took him by the hand and led him forward. Ernest could not tell what was being done, but he found himself walking on a rocky path, hand in hand with his guide. How far he walked he could not tell. It might have been 200 feet. Then his guide stopped, and of course he stopped too. Next the handkerchief was removed, and he found himself in what seemed a rocky cavern. At any rate, it was a large room of irregular shape, but the stone floor had been made smooth and was covered by a soft carpet. It was furnished like a sitting room in a private house. There were comfortable chairs, including a rocking chair and a capacious armchair. On one side of the room was an inviting-looking couch. Of course there would have been perfect darkness but for artificial light. On a table was a large student's lamp, and in a niche in the wall was another. Besides this, there was a lantern hanging from the roof of the chamber, but this was not lighted. Ernest looked about him with curiosity and surprise. It was something new to him, and recalled a story he had once read in which a cave dwelling was described. "Well, what do you think of it?" asked the outlaw, smiling. it is wonderful," said Ernest. "You did not know where I was bringing you?" "No. It is a cave, is it not?" "Well, it looks like it." "There are other rooms, are there not?" "Yes, but this is my private apartment. My parlor, you may call it. This is my sleeping room." He drew aside the hangings on the farther side and revealed an inner chamber of less size. On a bed Ernest's attention was drawn to the figure of a sleeping boy, evidently the original of the picture which the outlaw had shown him. "That is your son?" asked Ernest. "Yes, that is Frank." The outlaw's stern countenance softened as he regarded the sleeping boy. Suddenly the boy stirred. He opened his eyes, and when he recognized his father a glad smile lighted up his innocent face. "Papa!" he said, and James Fox bent over and kissed him. Chapter 17. Of a Cousin's Conspiracy, or a Boy's Struggle for an Inheritance, by Horatio Alger, Jr. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Abigail Rasmussen. Chapter 17. Frank. After kissing his father, the young boy looked inquisitively at Ernest. "Who is that boy, papa?" he asked. "I have brought him here to stay with you. Shall you like to have his company?" "Yes, papa. You know it is very lonely while you are away. What is his name?" The outlaw looked at Ernest significantly. He took the hint and answered, "My name is Ernest Ray." "How old are you, Ernest?" went on the boy. 16. "I am only 10." "Are you going to get up, Frank?" asked his father. "Yes," answered the young boy briskly. "I got sleepy because I was alone. Where did papa find you, Ernest?" "Oh, I met him outside and he took me to ride." James Fox looked approval of this answer. "I am glad you came with him." By this time Frank had slid from the bed and put his hand in Ernest's. "Come here," he said, "and I will show you my books." Led by his small companion, Ernest went up to a bookcase which he had not before observed in the main room. About 30 books stood on the shelves. "Where did you get your books?" he asked. "Papa bought them for me in Minneapolis. Were you ever in Minneapolis?" "No." "It is a nice place. Sometimes I think I would like to live there instead of here." "You are not getting tired of home, are you, Frank?" asked his father half reproachfully. "No, papa, but it is lonely here sometimes. Am I to live here always?" "No, Frank. Sometime I will send you to school. But you won't see me every day then." "Then I don't want to go." The outlaw stooped over and kissed the boy. "Now, Frank, I have something to do, so you may amuse yourself with Ernest." "Can you play dominoes?" asked Frank. "Yes. Have you a set?" "Yes." The boy opened a drawer in a bureau and drew out a box of dominoes. He poured them out on the table, and they began to play the ordinary game. When they tired of that, Ernest taught him a new one. After they grew tired of playing, Ernest read aloud to the boy from one of his favorite books. They were sitting together in the armchair when James Fox, who had left the room, returned. He smiled approvingly at the picture. He was pleased to think that he had found a companion whom his boy liked. "What have you been doing, Frank?" he asked. "He has been reading to me, papa. He reads nicely, and I like it very much." "I am sorry to interrupt you, but are not you young people hungry?" "I think I could eat something," answered Ernest. "Frank, you may bring him into the dining room." The drapery was lifted, and they passed into a room as large as the one they were in. On a table in the center a substantial meal, consisting principally of roast beef, was set forth. An old colored woman hovered near, evidently the cook. "Juba," said the outlaw, "this is a new boarder. His name is Ernest." "Glad to see you, Massa Ernest," rejoined the old woman, nodding her turban. "Sit down here next to Massa Frank." It seemed very strange to Ernest to reflect that he was the guest of one of the famous outlaws of whom he had heard so much. He was half inclined to doubt whether it was real. If he had been alone, he would have pinched himself to see whether he was awake or dreaming. Here he was in the bowels of the earth,
on intimate terms with an outlaw and his family. How long was he to stay in the cavern? That was a question impossible to answer. Meanwhile he was hungry, and the dinner was well cooked. "Where is Uncle John, papa?" asked Frank suddenly. Ernest remembered that one of the Fox brothers was named John, and he awaited the answer with interest. James Fox seemed busily thinking, and Frank had to repeat the question. "Your Uncle John?" repeated the outlaw. "He went away on business." "What kind of business, papa?" It was a natural question, but it startled James Fox. He saw that as his son became older it might not be easy to evade embarrassing questions. "You seem curious, Frank," he answered after a pause. "You wouldn't understand it if I were to tell you." "Will you teach me your business some day, papa?" It was on the tip of the outlaw's tongue to say "Heaven forbid!" but he only answered, "Wait till you are older, Frank, then we will talk about it." At length they rose from the table. They went back to the main room, and Ernest read a little more to the young boy, but Frank's eyes grew heavy, and he finally dropped off to sleep. "Shall I lay him on the bed, Mr. Fox?" asked Ernest. "No, I will do so." He took the boy tenderly in his arms. "If I had known he would fall asleep I would have undressed him," he said. After placing the boy on the bed he resumed his seat in the armchair and began to smoke. Finally he looked over at Ernest. "Do you like my little boy?" he asked abruptly. "He is a dear little fellow," answered Ernest. "So he is," said the father in a soft voice. "You have no prejudice against him because he is my son?" "No," answered Ernest. "Whatever you are, he is not responsible." "True, but all might not take that view of it. I don't know why I should speak so confidentially to you, lad, but if I ever regret my line of life it is when I look at him. I wouldn't like to have his future marred by his association with me. I wouldn't like people to turn from him because he was an outlaw's son." "I hope you will forgive my boldness," said Ernest, "but don't you think you will ever change your mode of life?" "It is too late. I am too well known. Yet, who knows?" he said after a pause. At 9 o'clock Juba entered the room. "Has John returned?" asked the outlaw. "No, massa." A shade of anxiety overspread the outlaw's face. "He should have been here before this," he said. Then, looking at Ernest, he said, "I'm going out a while. Lie down on the bed with Frank, and if he wakes up, undress him." "Yes, sir." An hour later Frank and Ernest were sleeping peacefully side by side. When Ernest awoke the next morning, Frank was still asleep on the bed beside him. In the large room adjoining, James Fox lay on the lounge. He had given up his bed to Ernest. He had not himself undressed, but had thrown himself on the couch in his ordinary clothes. Breakfast was ready by the time they were, and the three sat down together. "Where is Uncle John, papa?" asked Frank. "He has not returned, Frank," said James Fox soberly. "What made him stay away all night?" "Probably it was business," answered the outlaw, but Ernest noticed that he looked disturbed. In truth, he had been out till 2 o'clock seeking for his brother, who he feared had got into trouble. We know that he was in the prison at Crampton, whither he had been conveyed by Luke Robbins and Ezekiel Mason. Of course, it was in the mind of James Fox that his brother might have been arrested, since this was a risk which he daily incurred. Just as breakfast was over, there was a new arrival. It was a tall, stalwart fellow whom James Fox addressed as Hugh. "Do you bring any news, Hugh?" asked the outlaw eagerly. "Yes," answered Hugh Humphreys. "Is it about John?" Hugh glanced significantly at the two boys. Ernest he saw for the first time. James Fox understood and followed Hugh out of the room. "Well?" he said inquiringly, when they were out of hearing. "Mr. John is in trouble," answered Hugh briefly. "Go on," said James Fox. "Do you know where he is?" "In Crampton jail." "Go on. Give me the particulars." "He was carried there by two persons." "Who were they?" "One, I think, was a farmer who lives in Claremont. The other seemed to be a Quaker." "I don't remember any Quaker in this neighborhood,"
He must be a stranger hereabouts." "I think I have seen him before," said Hugh. "Where?" "At the Emmonsville bank. I was passing there one day in disguise, and chancing to look in I saw this man sitting on a bench near the paying teller's desk." "Ah," said James Fox, thoughtfully. "He may be a detective." "That is what I thought." "That is bad news, but the jail at Crampton is not very strong. I have been confined there myself and made my escape. However, John will need assistance from the outside." "I see you have a new boy," said Hugh curiously. "When did you pick him up?" "Yesterday, a few miles from here. He is a bank messenger." "From what bank?" "The Emmonsville bank." "Then he may know something of this Quaker detective?" "Well suggested. I will question him." Chapter 18.
Of a Cousin's Conspiracy or a Boy's Struggle for an Inheritance by Horatio Alger, Jr. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Abigail Rasmussen. Chapter 18. Fox's Band. When James Fox returned to the apartment where the boys were still seated at the table, he said, "Ernest, I should like to speak to you a minute." Ernest followed him out of the room. "Is there any person connected with the bank at Emmonsville who wears the dress of a Quaker?" began the outlaw. Ernest hesitated a moment. "Speak out, boy," said Fox. "I must and will know." "Yes, sir." "Is he a detective?" "He may act as such." "Is he under pay at the bank?" "I think he is." "Do you know where he is now?" "No." "Was he at the bank when you left it yesterday afternoon?" "No, sir." "Do you know where he was?" "I saw him ride away with a farmer." James Fox and Hugh exchanged glances. Their suspicions were confirmed. "Is he in any trouble?" asked Ernest, becoming a questioner in his turn. "No. For aught I know, he may be at the bank." Ernest looked relieved, and for two reasons. He was glad that Luke was not in trouble. Then he knew that when his disappearance was discovered, Luke would leave no stone unturned to rescue him. It was a comfort to think that he had a powerful friend outside. "That will do," said the outlaw. "You may return to Frank." "How long are you going to keep me here?" asked Ernest anxiously. "Are you tired of remaining with us?" There was something in the outlaw's tone that savored of kindness. Ernest felt that in some way he had ingratiated himself with him. "I would like my freedom. I am not used to confinement," he said. "Very natural. I cannot let you go just yet, but I will not allow you to be harmed. Listen. I shall be away all day probably. Do what you can to amuse Frank." "I will. I should be very lonely without him." "That is a good boy, Hugh," said James Fox, as Ernest left them. "I should like to keep him with us." "Why don't you then?" "I am afraid he would be unhappy." "I never knew you to take such a liking to a boy before." "I never have. Indeed, I have seldom met any. All my dealings have been with men. But, Hugh, we must lose no time. We must try to rescue John. It is no more than he would do for me if our cases were reversed." "Very well, Captain. I am ready to follow you wherever you lead." "I know that, Hugh. You have always been faithful to my brother and myself." "I always will be, Captain," said Hugh, with a look of loyal devotion. "I know it. I am sure that we have no better friend than Hugh Humphries." "You only do me justice, Captain. Will you forgive me if I say something?" "Say what you please, Hugh." "What you have said of me is just, but I don't think you can say it of all in the band." "Is there anyone whom you suspect?" "I don't take much stock in Peter Longman." "I am afraid you are suspicious, Hugh." "Not without cause. I have noticed some things about him that I don't like. I think he is quite capable of turning against you." "I have never remarked anything of the sort, but I know you would not speak without cause. Tell me what you want me to do." "Only to be on your guard. Don't trust Peter as you trust me." "I never have. And now have you any suggestions to make?"
You might visit this farmer who helped the Quaker arrest your brother." "It may be a good plan. Who is the farmer?" "His name is Ezekiel Mason," said Hugh. "I know where he lives. He is the last man I should suppose would be capable of such mischief." "He could have done nothing without the Quaker's help." "Very well. We will take the farm on the way. Still, I don't know that we shall learn anything beyond what we already know," said James. Before leaving the cave they disguised themselves as farm workmen. In this dress they approached the farmhouse, but there was something that diverted them from their original purpose and led them to keep their distance. Sitting on the portico was a tall man dressed as a Quaker. "That's the man," said Hugh quickly. "That's the man who drove up to the jail last evening with your brother." James Fox looked at him closely. "It is best to let sleeping dogs lie," he said. "We will push on to the jail." Chapter 19 of A Cousin's Conspiracy, or A Boy's Struggle for an Inheritance, by Horatio Alger, Jr. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Abigail Rasmussen. Chapter 19. Living with Thieves. Meanwhile, Ernest was left in the cave with Frank. He had been brought in blindfolded, and was therefore ignorant as to the entrance or exit. He thought he might, without arousing the boy's suspicion, seek information from him on these points. "Are there many rooms here, Frank?" he asked. "Oh, a good many," answered the boy. "Have you been in many?" "I have been around with papa." "I should like to go around," said Ernest. "Suppose we take a little walk?" The boy was quite ready to accept any suggestion from Ernest. So he took his hand and they went from the main room farther into the cavern. Ernest found that only the portion near the entrance had been furnished. Beyond there was a large amount of empty space. Here and there a small light revealed trunks and boxes arranged without regard to regularity. These, Ernest conjectured, contained stolen articles which had accumulated during the years in which the dreaded outlaws had been a power and a menace in the neighborhood. It occurred to him that he would like to open some of these boxes, but the companionship of the boy prevented. He ventured to ask, however, "What is in these boxes, Frank?" "I don't know. Something of papa's and Uncle John's." As they kept on they reached parts of the cavern which were quite empty. The Fox brothers were in the position of householders who occupied a house too large for their needs. By and by the lamps ceased and the portion farther on looked dark and gloomy. "I am afraid to go on any further, Ernest." "Why, Frank? What are you afraid of?" "There may be wild animals there." "But how could they live there?" "I don't know, but papa told me there were some." Ernest understood why the boy had been told this. It was to prevent his going too far. But it made Ernest all the more eager to continue his explorations. "Even if there were any wild animals, I would protect you, Frank." "But we may not find our way back. It is too dark," said the child with a shudder. "I won't go farther. But see, it seems to be lighter." At a point 50 feet farther on, through a rift in the roof, a gleam of light entered the cavern. Ernest was anxious to trace this, for as he judged it came from some outlet through which he might possibly obtain deliverance. "Stay where you are," he said. "I will just go forward and see what I can." "Don't stay long," entreated Frank nervously. "No, I won't." Ernest was just as well pleased to go forward alone, for if there were really, as he supposed, an outlet, it was as well that Frank should not have his attention drawn to it, lest he should speak of it to his father and so reveal the fact of their explorations. This might excite the suspicion of James Fox and put a stop to their further walks. Continuing on alone, Ernest then saw perhaps 15 feet above him an opening some 3 feet in diameter, through which he could obtain a glimpse of the clear sky above. It made his heart beat with exultation and longing. There was freedom if he could only manage somehow to lift himself up to the outlet and make his way through it.
What is it, Ernest?" asked Frank.
"Oh, it is nothing," answered Ernest, with studied indifference. "It isn't anything you would care to see." The little boy accepted this assurance, for he did not feel the interest that excited Ernest. "Let us go back," he said, as he resumed his clasp of Ernest's hand. "Yes, we will go back. Have you ever been as far as this before?" "No." "Then we had better not say anything about it. Your papa might not like it." "All right, Ernest. Will you read to me when you go back?" "Yes, Frank." Ernest was glad to comply with the little boy's request, as he thought he might in this way put the thoughts of their exploration out of his mind. They were fortunate enough to get back without exciting the attention of Juba, who was busy in the kitchen. Her work, however, was soon over, and she brought her sewing into the room where the two boys were seated. "Well, Master Frank, what am you doing?" "Ernest is reading to me. Why don't you ever read to me, Juba?" "Oh, Lord, chile, you know I can't read." "But why can't you read? You're old enough." "Yes, honey, I'm old enough, but I never had no chance to learn." "Why didn't you?" persisted Frank. "Didn't you go to school when you were little?" "No, chile, never went to school. They didn't have no schools where I was raised." "Where was that?" "In ole Virginny." "Were you a slave, Juba?" asked Ernest. "Yes, massa, I was a slave." "And how did you get here?" "It was all along of the war. Ole massa he went to the war and got killed. Then young massa went, and he got killed too. Then one day there came an officer, one of Abe Linkum's officers, and he told us we were free and might go where we pleased." "Weren't you glad to be free?" asked Ernest. "No, honey, we didn't know where to go nor what to do. We'd all us had some one to look after us, but now there wasn't anybody." "Were you married, Juba?" "Yes, but I don't know whether my ole man is living or not. He was sold down in Georgy to a cousin of ole massa's." "Then he may be living yet?" "Yes, honey." "How old are you, Juba?" asked Frank. "I don't know, chile. I'se powerful old. Specs I'se 100." Ernest smiled. "No, Juba," he said, "you are not nearly 100. You may be 60." "Juba, did you ever hear about Uncle Tom?" "Yes, chile, I knew Uncle Tom," was the unexpected reply. "He was raised on Mr. Jackson's place, next to ours." Ernest asked some question about this Uncle Tom, but learned, as he expected, that it was quite a different person from the negro immortalized by Mrs. Stowe. In looking over Frank's books, Ernest found an old copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and taking it down he read some portions, particularly those relating to Topsy. Both Frank and Juba were very much entertained. "Did you know Topsy, Juba?" asked Frank. "No, chile, never knowed Topsy. She must have been no account young nigger. If she'd lived on our plantation she'd have got flogged for her impudence." "How did you come here, Juba?" asked Frank. "One of them officers took me to Chicago. I lived out with a lady, but when she died I went to a 'telligence office, and there I met your papa. He brought me here. I didn't at first like living down under the ground, but I don't mind it now. Master Fox treats me well, and I ain't no wish to change." This was the substance of what Juba had to communicate. The rest of the day passed quietly. At nightfall James Fox came home, looking very sober, but he came alone. Chapter 20. Of a Cousin's Conspiracy, or a Boy's Struggle for an Inheritance, by Horatio Alger, Jr. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Abigail Rasmussen. Chapter 20. Ernest Explores the Cave. James Fox had very little to say during the evening. He was evidently preoccupied and anxious, and paid scant attention to the boys. Frank knew so little of his father's business or occupation that he could conceive of no cause for worriment. When his advances met with little response, he asked, "Have you got a headache, papa?" "No, yes, child. My head troubles me some. Be as quiet as you can."
Will it disturb you if I play checkers with Ernest, papa?" "No, I should like to have you amuse yourself," answered the outlaw. He directed the boys to go to bed early. They slept together, and he threw himself on the lounge without taking off his clothes. Ernest slept well. When he woke up at 8 o'clock he saw that Frank was still sleeping, but his host was already up. Juba came into the room. "Get up, children," she said. "Breakfast is ready." "Where is papa?" asked Frank. "He took breakfast an hour ago, honey." "What made him get up so early?" "'Portant business called him away." "Where's Uncle John?" "He hasn't been home." "Has he got 'portant business too?" "'Specs he has, honey." "It doesn't seem nice to take breakfast without papa," said the little boy. "You may consider me your papa, Frank," observed Ernest. "But you're not big enough to be a papa." When breakfast was over there was the long day before them to be filled up in some way. "Don't you ever wish to go out of the cave, Frank?" asked Ernest. "Where?" asked the little boy. "Into the bright sunshine, out on the green grass and under the trees." "Yes, I think I should like it," answered Frank thoughtfully. "But papa does not want me to go. I don't know why. Do many little boys live in caves like me?" "No, I don't think so." "Can they walk about in the sunshine and play?" "I always did." "Do you like it better than living here?" "Yes." "Then what made you come here?" This was an embarrassing question, and Ernest felt that he must answer carefully. "Your papa wanted me to make you a visit," he replied after a pause. "And I'm glad you came. It isn't so lonely for me. Before I only had Juba." "Wouldn't she play with you?" asked Ernest with a smile. "Juba is too old to play. I hope you will stay with me a good while." Ernest could not echo this wish, so he answered evasively: "I can't tell yet how long I shall stay, but the time will come when you will leave the cave and live like the other little boys in the house." "Did papa tell you that?" "He told me that he should send you to school before long." "What is school like?" asked the little boy anxiously. "There will be a good many boys, some older, some younger than yourself. You will study lessons together and play together." "I think that will be nice." "Yes, I am sure you will enjoy it. Did you ever go to school?" "Oh, yes, I went to school for some years." "Perhaps you will go to school with me." "I can't tell," answered Ernest vaguely. "Perhaps Juba will go to school with you." Frank laughed. "She would look funny going to school," he said. "What's dat you sayin' 'bout Juba, Massa Ernest?" asked the old woman. "I told Frank you might go to school with him." "Maybe I'd go and take care of him, honey." "But you wouldn't want to study?" "I wouldn't study nohow. I's a poor, ignorant nigger." "Don't you think you could learn to read?" "No, I couldn't. It takes white folks to read." "No, Juba. When I went to school there was a colored boy in my class, and he was one of the smartest scholars we had." "And he was a nigger?" asked Juba. "We didn't call him that, but he was a colored boy. If he could learn to read I am sure you could." "It's no use, child. I'm too old now." Much as he liked Frank, it was irksome to Ernest to remain all day in the cave. They got through the forenoon somehow, taking dinner at 12 o'clock. About 2 o'clock Frank complained of being sleepy. "You won't mind if I go to sleep for an hour, Ernest?" he said. "Oh, no," answered Ernest. "I can read." Since his exploration of the day before, Ernest had been longing to visit once more the same portion of the cave, but he wanted to go alone. He had a hope that through the aperture in the roof he might effect his escape. It would not do to have Frank with him, as this would interfere with his plan. Now the longed for opportunity was almost at hand. He took a volume from the bookshelf and sitting down beside the boy began to read. But his mind was not on the book, though at another time he would have enjoyed it. He watched Frank, and in less than 15 minutes saw that he was fast asleep. Then he left the room, Juba being occupied in the kitchen. He secured his hat, as he would need it in case he effected his escape. As he passed through that apartment in the cave where there were trunks and boxes, it occurred to him to open one of them. He was rather surprised that it should be unlocked. It was filled with a miscellaneous assortment of articles, but on top, to his surprise and joy, he recognized the envelope containing the bonds that had been taken from him. If he left the cave he would want these, and therefore he had no hesitation in taking them. He put them in the inside pocket of his vest and kept on his way. In a short time he reached the spot lighted by the aperture in the roof. The opening was large enough for him to get through, but the difficulty was that it was 15 feet above the floor of the cave. Ernest was something of a gymnast, but it was out of his power to reach the opening through which he could obtain deliverance. He looked about to see if there were any articles he could pile upon one another to attain the aperture, but the cave was quite empty of articles of any description, nor could he find any that he could move in the portions which he had already traversed. It was aggravating to be so near freedom and yet unable to obtain it. Just above him he could see the blue sky and the cheerful sunshine, while he was a prisoner in a dark cavern. Was there no way of reaching the opening? He asked himself. If he had to give up hope, he would feel obliged to return the envelope to the box from which he had taken it. Were its loss discovered, he would of course be searched and kept in stricter seclusion than before. In the room used by the outlaw as a sitting room he might be able to find what he needed, but he could not remove anything without being detected, and should he return there he would possibly find Frank awake, which would spoil all. It looked as if he would have to give up the chance that had come to him. In thoughtful mood he walked slowly back. All at once an idea struck him. In the room where the trunks and boxes were stored he had seen a long rope. Could he do anything with it? Looking up at the aperture he noticed a jagged projection on one side. If I could attach the rope to that, he reflected, I could draw myself up hand over hand till I reached the top, and then it would go hard if I didn't get out. With new hope in his heart, he retraced his steps rapidly till he reached the storeroom. He knew just where to look for the rope. He examined it carefully and found it very stout and strong. He took it back with him. Then, making a loop at one end, he stood under the opening and threw it up as he would a lasso. He had to try a dozen times before he contrived to circle the projection with the loop. Then, pulling it taut, he began to climb hand over hand as he had many a time done in sport. Now his deliverance depended upon it. Slowly, foot by foot, he approached the opening, not knowing whether if he reached it he would be able to draw himself through the hole. End of chapter 20.